I'm Arian Mack, and I'm director of the Center for Public Scholarship, under whose auspices this event is occurring. This is a social research conference. It is the 27th such conference. We started this series in 1988, so we're coming into our quarter century of holding public conferences, about which at least I feel quite pleased. So, social research, which is the sort of flagship journal of the New School for Social Research, was started in 1934 by Alvin Johnson, who was the first president of the New School, along with a very small group of rescued scholars and intellectuals who Johnson had the perspicacity to rescue from the mounting savagery that was occurring in Europe. And that small group was known, and has been famously known now, as the University in Exile. The University in Exile became, a year later, in 1934, the graduate faculty of the New School for Social Research, and was then able to give degrees. But it still was this very small group of largely German, largely Jewish, rescued intellectuals. And over the years, of course, it has grown. In 34, this group, with Johnson, launched the journal. And they did so because Johnson was committed to the idea that intellectuals need to be engaged in public life. And of course, the University in Exile scholars, all of whom had spoken out during the rise of Hitler, were certainly sympathetic and actually, in their own lives, exemplified their engagement with public life. We hope that this conference series just continues in that spirit. We try to choose subjects which we think are of current urgency, current importance, and I certainly think you would all agree with me that putting together a conference on Egypt in transition couldn't be more timely. And we're very lucky in doing this to have actually a number of experts who came explicitly for the purpose from Cairo to talk to us, and as well as experts already here in the United States. This will be the summer. The papers, we have an issue coming out this summer called Egypt in Transition. Most of the people speaking at this conference are writing for the issue. There are also people writing for the issue who are unable to come to the conference because of other things. I don't think I need to say very much about why we chose this subject once the uprising was initiated in Tahrir Square in January 2011. I think that's the right date. It quickly became obvious, particularly since we had begun a series in 1989 on transitions. It was right at the point that the Soviet Empire collapsed in 1990, and we've done quite a number of issues on regions or countries in transition. We've done one on Africa, we've done China, we've done India, and of course we did East and Central Europe. So this today's conference is very much consistent with that transition series, and we're very pleased to be able to do it. So I want you to know that the summer issue, which will contain the papers on Egypt, will be available. You can order it outside in the lobby, and we encourage you to, of course, subscribe to Social Research if you will. Okay, so it's now my great pleasure to introduce the moderator for this morning's session. But before I do, I have just a very little to say, which is that the issue of social research that's forthcoming and this conference would not have happened without the mentoring and engagement of my friend and once colleague Talal Assad, who's just played a major role in organizing both the issue, of which he is a guest editor, and the conference. Talal will be a discussant tonight for when our keynote speaker gives his keynote address, and also will be moderating the afternoon session. Now it is my pleasure to, it's now my pleasure to thank people. I need to thank people because we can't do a conference unless someone gives us money. We have to go out of the New School and raise money. We raise money from almost exclusively from foundations, and we were very fortunate to get support for this conference from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. This wouldn't have happened without it, and they've been quite generous supporters of this conference series. Obviously, they don't support all the conferences, but they've supported more than this one. The New School's provost office also was able to give us some modest support, and we are grateful for that as well. So I am now pleased to introduce the moderator of this morning's session, which, as you know, is broken into two halves. It has a brief half-hour intermission in its center. It's the title of the morning is Roots and Character of the Egyptian Revolution. Juan Cole is the Richard P. Mitchell Collegiate Professor of History at the University of Michigan. For 3 decades, he has sought to put the relationship of the West and the Muslim world in historical context. His most recent book is Engaging the Muslim World, and he has also recently authored Napoleon's Egypt, Invading the Middle East. He has been a regular guest on PBS's Lara News, the NewsHour, and also appeared on ABC, Nightly News, Nightline, The Today Show, Charlie Rose, Anderson Cooper, and others. Did you say how many people follow you on Twitter?
Oh, it's getting to be nearly 17,000.
So he's very active and very well known and writes a great deal on the subject that we are going to be addressing today, and it's now my pleasure to turn this all over to Juan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arian, and thanks to everybody for coming out on this beautiful morning. Our first panel is going to consist of discussions on the roots and character of the Egyptian Revolution. Our speakers have 20 minutes, whatever they have been told, it's 20 minutes. Each to put some things on the table for us, and then I hope we can have a lively discussion thereafter. I just do want to remind everybody that when we go to taking questions, they should be questions. We brought our panelists sometimes from a long way away, and they have been spending a lot of time writing on these subjects, so they don't need their talk to be given again from a different perspective, and you can just ask them what they think, which is about the issues, which is what we're here for. Please do ask questions rather than making speeches when we go to that part. Our first speaker is Hazem Fahmy, an economist and writer at the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, who has written on the economic situation that fed into the revolution. And then Mohammed Tabishat is an assistant professor of anthropology at the American University in Cairo. who not only is a professor of anthropology and an academic, but also is a public intellectual and has been writing at a really superb website called Jadaliya. It's JADALIWWA.com. And Jadaliya, in my view, gathers together some of the best commentary on the events in the Middle East of the last year. And many of the contributors are themselves activists, academics, and many of them are Arab in origin. So it is a different world than our American newspapers. So it's wonderful that Mohammed has been putting his thoughts there as well. So I'll turn it now over to Hazem Fahmy.
I should be using the PowerPoint, so I suspect.
Yes, please go.
I haven't been told how to show it on the screen. It's already showing here, but not on. Oh, yeah, there you go. Okay. It was very difficult to write an article about the causes of the Egyptian revolution due to the challenges you face in writing such a thing. Part of it, as you see on the screen, is for the rich historical heritage of Egypt, demographic complexities, the long term of Mubarak, and the successive layers of policies and fragmentations, as well as the researcher's subjectivities, depending where you come from. There are so many ways to tell the story of the Egyptian revolution. So one reasonable starting point was simply to get just the initial slogan that the revolution had, which was bread, freedom, and social justice, in order to attempt to capture what led to this revolution. Of course, this in a couple of days turned into the people want to oust the regime. So from a call to reform to a revolution, which happened very spontaneously and very rapidly. So in order to organize the stream of thought, there are you can divide it, could be done in so many ways, but I thought one systematic way of going around it, and this is basically the paper, that there are three research strands about how the revolution came about. One of them was the 30 years of emergency law, and this has two sub-strands under it, the evolution of the security apparatus and its brutality by the end that people became fed up with it, and a lot of abuses that happens under it. This was coupled with two other trends. There was an evolution of economic corruption and profiteering also in the system that in the last few years reached unprecedented heights, and also political corruption and the issue of the succession debate. The interaction of these three led to the triggers mainly of the revolution. People might differ on different weights or how did it happen or why, but I think these three strands would be common in no matter which way you tell the story. This would be an important part of it. Now, under the first strand, the issue of the 30-year emergency law, the two sub-strands is the issue of the religion and politics in Egypt, and the other one is the evolution of police itself. I try to take a quick historical approach and scan it to see how these things started. And religion and politics, which is the first strand, it starts with, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood, which was established in 1928. By school teacher Hassan al-Banna, who basically was aspiring to apply the principles of...
I'm sorry, Hazem, your cell phone may be downloading data. That might be what's causing.
Is that the case, you think? I can leave it with you? Am I safe now? Okay. So the first trace of religion into politics in Egypt was in 1928 when the Muslim Brotherhood was established by a school teacher named Hassan al-Banna, who had a vision of preaching the principles of Islam and transforming society to be a better one. He had so many followers due to the appeal of his message, and the society is religious by nature. He was called as the Murshid, or the guide, And there was like a very strict discipline of loyalty and discipline within the Brotherhood since it was established. And today it covers around 72 countries with millions of followers. And because mostly it was working underground, there's a lot that's unknown about how, how the, like, for example, the financing and how they operate and the networking and so on. But it's a very well-organized group. Also, the introduction of political violence for the religious background started also by the Muslim Brotherhoods. In the 1920s, they established what they call the secret apparatus. This was a military arm of the group, and its main reason was to fight back the British occupiers and some of the Zionist organizations that landed in Palestine. But, however, this apparatus started doing local operations as well. Two famous ones were the assassination in the 1940s of a judge called Al-Khazindar, and this was due to the fact that he had a harsh sentence on one of the Brotherhoods. And then the second one was assassinating the Prime Minister, Fahmy. And there was another Prime Minister, actually, which later on turned out he was assassinated by the apparatus as well. It seems that the apparatus went out of control of the guy himself. And Hassan al-Banna, in his later years, even issued a statement saying, "Laysu ikhwanan wa laysa muslimin," which means they are neither Muslims nor brothers. But the damage was done, and he himself was assassinated at the end of his life. And it's widely believed that's in retaliation from the security apparatus due to that. After that, in 1952 revolution, when it came upon, it banned all political parties in Egypt because accusing them that during the monarchy's time there was a lot of corruption and. But the only group that was allowed to stay in politics was the Muslim Brothers, who were allies of the revolution. However, in 1954, they came in a direct clash with President Nasser, and they tried to assassinate him. There's a big controversy whether that was true or not, but it seems it was true. And since then, they were banned, and they were underground since 1954 till 2011, after the Egyptian revolution. So these acts of violence that by the secret apparatus led some analysts to stigmatize them as a terrorist group or one that always resorts to violence to implement. Of course, this is not entirely accurate, but at least that history still stigmatizes them in some ways. Then Nasser jailed them, and they were also tortured a lot, and most of their ideologues. And out of prison, some offshoots came out of them, very extreme radical ways of thinking, which think this whole society is like infidel and they're no good because they are not following the guidance of Islam and so on. And then those people, when they were released later on, they started the wave of assassinations and the violence in Egypt. They were not direct Muslim Brotherhoods, but they were offshoots, people who were in prison and then later on became like that. When Sadat took power, he tried after a few years to change the legacy of Nasser to be more liberal and more Western-oriented and establish a free market. And in order to counter the leftist tendencies that was left by Nasser and the other Nasserists, he started to build bridges with them. He released them from prison, give them freedom to access to media and universities and everything. And they started to dominate the cult in a way. I must also, I failed to mention that in 1967, the defeat by Egypt from Israel also caused a huge religious atmosphere in Egypt. I mean, people thought that the nationalistic experience and the pan-Arab experience was a failure because people were away from God, and so it also gives some infusion and sympathies to the Muslim Brotherhoods and the religious trend in general. So, however, they came in clash again with Sadat, and he was assassinated by some of those extremists. And then there came another under Mubarak regime, there came another big story. I mean, after Sadat was assassinated, they started also a wave of campaigns internally. They assassinated several politicians, writers, and they targeted even tourists. There was the famous Luxor incident in 1997. But then Mubarak was always warning that this is going to be a global issue, and nobody listened to him. This is one of the things he was right on. He thought that this thing was a big treasure, but also the same mistake that Sadat did was done on a global level. In the fight against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, by many United States and others, they trained Al-Qaeda and others to fight back the other superpower in Afghanistan. So those people became well trained in explosive and guerrilla warfare and once the Soviet Union was defeated, they came back to their countries, including Egypt, and started a new wave of terrorist campaigns because they wanted to change the regime and build religious societies again, or Islamic societies under a fundamentalist, an extreme view of Islam in their opinion, or in our opinion. And then came the September 11. And then it really became a global issue. And then the fight against terror became a global issue. Throughout this, in Egypt and abroad, religious activism became very much spotted by security agencies throughout. And it was a fight that had a lot of confusion. Some people were targeted rightly, some were unrightly, but it was a very ugly one. So this is a very sketchy view about religion and politics in Egypt since the Hassan al-Banna and the Muslim Brotherhood and now. Now I come to the other side, which is about the police. Egypt, by its nature, this is a map of Egypt. The Nile is a very strong river, and it gives it life. And it needs, by nature, there is this famous geographer, Gamal Hamdan. He wrote a book, encyclopedia actually, about the character of Egypt. And mainly, this Nile necessitated the presence, since long time ago, a very strong central government to regulate irrigation and to do projects and stuff like that. And this is a police contingent since the pharaonic times, so that always necessitated a very strong and heavy-handed presence of the state. And it had ambivalent relation between the population and the state. There was always the fear of the heavy hand of the state, but in the same time, it was necessitated by agriculture and by the fact that the Nile. So, how did the new security apparatus start in Egypt? Because there is a history that's not unique about what happened in recent years. In 1910, there was an attempt to assassinate the Prime Minister of Egypt. His name was Boutros Ghali, and he's the great-grandfather of the former Secretary General of the United Nations. He was accused of being a sympathizer with the British occupiers then, and then he was assassinated. So the occupying powers, Britain, which stayed in Egypt for a very long time, between 1882 till 1956, they established the first security apparatus in the Egyptian police, and its role was to spot those who are against the occupation. And many of them were exiled to Malta. And one of their primary targets was Al-Azhar, which is the religious institution in Egypt, because for a long time it was the main producer of revolutionaries or people who are asking for change. Anyway, so this evolved later on to become called the political police. It was controlled by either the occupiers or the palace. The king himself used it against his enemies, and it also had some brutal tactics in oppressing people and so on. Egypt had its, in that sense, when the revolution came in 1952, it banned the political police, but it made use of all its cadres in establishing new apparatus and security regime. And this also, they imported some Nazi experts to help them in having this new security regime. And they had two famous ones, the Egyptian intelligence as well as the military police. They were notorious in suppressing opponents. Then later on, when Sadat came to power and he had his struggle to check the Nasrist elements when he changed orientations, he established the State Security Agency, which took over then. And this also became the new heavy hand of the state. And it was very effective under Mubarak in terms of countering the religious extremism, particularly they were main target then, in addition to many civilian secular activists, including Dr. Saabin Ibrahim, who we have with us today in the audience. Across time, all this we had, by the way, Egypt since 1967 till today, I mean till like last year or this year, has been uninterruptedly governed under emergency law, with the exception of 18 months. But the new installation was after the assassination of President Sadat in 1981. And under emergency laws, the police has unchecked power almost to detain anybody without due process of law. And sometimes they release them on paper to arrest them again. And of course, they had tortures and so on, particularly with the extremists. And sometimes there was like orders simply to shoot on sight any religious activist when terrorism was in a height between the state and the religious fundamentalists. At the beginning, people had sympathy to the imposition of emergency laws because there was a total breakdown of law and the state itself was threatened. But as time went by, the police became much more corrupt and the abuses became against political opponents, not just against militants or people who resort to violence. And many civilians, like here I have Dr. Saabin Ibrahim, you have Ibrahim Isa, who was a famous journalist who simply broke the rule of silence in criticizing the president And there is Ayman Noor, who was a presidential candidate as well. And this photo here shows you how brutal police was. Like, it's like 20 people against an unarmed man trying to subjugate him. And torture became, and then later on there was other developments on the two other trends I'm talking about, which will be the political and the economic, where corruption, where there came an alliance between the top police generals and the corrupt elite politically and economically. Now the second strand is the political corruption. I'll run through it quickly. I don't know how's time going, but under Mubarak, basically Egypt went through three phases of economics. One of them was in the first decade of the 80s. He mainly invested a lot in rehabilitating the infrastructure, and this is part of his legacy. It continued further on. But that ended up Egypt with a heavy debt burden. By 1990, we had like a 15 billion foreign debt, and which was unserviceable. I mean, most of the government revenues went to that. So basically, he had, there was no way economic reform would be implemented. Then a big chance came with the war on, to liberate Kuwait as a prize for Egypt for its leading role in galvanizing the Arab world. We got a 50% discount from the foreign debt. It was written off in return for an economic reform program, which was quite successful, but was a little bit extreme in the sense that it had it was quite neoliberal, you know, the typical Washington consensus formula, deregulation, liberalization, and there was no safety nets really for a lot of poor people. But also there another development in the 1990s. The sons of the president graduated from university and they started working into business, both of them. And they began to have also associates around them, and that's when really recent corruption started in terms of the economic system. In the third phase, which is the 2000-2011, this became so much systematized that it went out of hand, and as a result of it, there was a total inequality in distribution of wealth that we had in Egypt. Mainly, we had, you know, these are resorts and these are new malls, but we had also a lot of poverty and a lot of people who were left out. And this was by itself a recipe for disaster and revolution when you have so much wealth being accumulated, particularly through corruption. And there were so many mechanisms that were used. There was a lot of insider trading in the stock market. There was a land grab. Lands were given almost for free for big businessmen who are associated with the president and his sons. Both sons married from business families who also expanded their business after marrying that. And they were notorious for having, you know, stakes in all major business deals in the country. Just a quick demographic covering for the characteristics. In 2006, Egyptian population was estimated to be 72.8. Now it's around 85 million. There were 30 million people who are working in the informal sector or unemployed, which is a huge number. It's almost half of it. So these are people basically unaccounted for in terms of they're having like daily jobs that are not secure at all. They're either domestic housing or daily laborers or vendors, street vendors, stuff like that. And the other who are in the formal sector were not necessarily in a very good condition because many of them were government employees also who were having very subsistence salaries that were not enough for them, which was also a very big recipe for corruption. Another evolving thing on the of poverty, we had like 12.2 million people living in slums, and these are really very hard conditions. No electricity, no sewage system, no water, no clean water. I mean, it's just horrible conditions in the... And there was 10 million employed in the marginal economy, but those, by the way, are intersecting. These are not separate numbers, but just it's a graphic way of statistics. And finally, the third strand, the political corruption, which started. Egypt had, by political corruption, I'm mainly referring to violating basic democratic principles and rules. And Egypt has a long history in that. We had the monarchy till 1952. In 1866, we had the first parliament in the Middle East, probably. And in 1923, Egypt had its first civil revolution. It was against occupation. And we had a first constitution, a real constitution, 1923, which gave real powers to the parliament. But elections since 1923 till the revolution, 1952, were almost rigged all the time because the king or the occupiers did not want the popular party, which was the left, to win the elections. So through these 40 years, only almost 7 years where we had fair elections where the left was in power. So the practice of rigging elections and even changing constitutions, the king attempted to change the constitution in 1930 and to make it in his favor, massive demonstrations broke out, and the political police brutally suppressed them, which is kind of remnant of what's happening now. People say that that's nothing compared to what happened later on. I mean, the whole idea of getting this flash is that it has been there. I mean, it's not something new that has been happening, but the extent has been much more greater.
Hazem, 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay. So let me quickly to Mubarak. Basically, there was the National Democratic Party who was ruling Egypt, and he rigged all elections. His son assumed the second post in it, and the most important post, the head of the policy committee, where he basically were dictating for the government what to do. And he had his colleague and monopolist in steel, Ahmed Ez, who was writing the antitrust laws who were guiding his own business, which was steel, and he controlled 65% of the steel market. These are pictures of how police used to rig elections. Here, in 2005, they literally prevented people going for the ballot boxes. So they tried to climb ladders from back windows to jump in to get it, and there's a police guy trying to get him off. On the down here, there's thugs basically preventing also the voters from voting. And on the right-hand side, this is a sewage system. They simply drain it off in the street so that people cannot reach the polling stations. All this led to, I mean, the economic corruption, police corruption and abuse, as well as the political, led, of course, to signs of breaking the walls of fear. You find activists in Egypt starting particularly in the 2000s to break that silence. And al-Baradi was one of the famous characters who did that. The 6th of April movement, came out in support of Mahala textile labor. And then came the famous role of the youth through the social media and its use. And this was the big trigger of the revolution. Those people were so apolitical, very well educated, and they were not your desperate part of society. And they are the ones who really led and triggered these initial days of the revolution. Later on, they were joined by the entire society, unfortunately, the incidents after that, they did not get the power they deserve. But anyway, it was the use of social media and those people. This picture was a guy who was tortured. His name is Khaled Said. Some people say this is the one that triggered the revolution. He was killed by police in 2010, in June. And this led Wa'il Ghanim, the famous Google guy, who established a website called We Are All Khaled Said. And he got 70,000 people signing in immediately. And that's one of the first sites that's also triggered the demonstrations in the 25th of January that triggered the revolution. As a natural result of that, this is the headquarters of the National Democratic Party, which was burned on the 3rd day of the revolution. And it was a natural end of an era. And unfortunately, we are 1 year after the revolution. The 3 cries of bread, freedom, social justice, and dignity are not yet realized. It's still work in progress. There are serious signs that there might be a second round. But hopefully the spirit of those young people who led the revolution, and I think this lower picture is very expressive. This young man, barehanded, is almost attacking 20 police officers, fully armed. And those are the guys who led the revolution. And those 3 strands really triggered it over time. I encourage you to read the article. It has more details, of course. And just to try to squeeze things, I did it telegraphically as much as I can. And the story is still not finished, and remains to be seen. Thank you.
It's up to you.
Okay, I'll just speak from here.
You have to speak into the microphone.
Yeah, it's working. Well, good morning, everyone. I don't know what to do after this elegant and very colorful, extensive review of the Egyptian history, as my presentation is actually quite focused, rather than, extensive. It's actually focused on films produced in the period between 1992 and 2010. And there are 3 ideas that just made me focus on films. It might not be the time now to go through them. Maybe I will just speak about them during the time of discussion. Let me just read so that I can save time. Traffic Light is a film produced in 1995. The plot is rather simple. A traffic light goes out of service. It is located at the end of Talat Harb Street, leading to the Tahrir Square. The whole street is jammed, and cars with people and people sitting around or hanging around their cars. The traffic finally starts. not because the signal works, but because an obscure explosion goes off at Al-Tahrir Square. Before then, however, individuals from different social backgrounds who never knew each other before have a chance to meet and talk, interact, and even start relations. They include a young man looking for a job. He meets a woman facing pressures to accept a low-status job as a belly dancer. Next, there is a businessman in a Mercedes with a wireless phone he keeps using to talk directly to high officials, including the president of the country. He is assisted by an ambitious policeman who originally came to help solve the traffic jam. There is also an old man and his wife who is pregnant. The man is a history teacher. The jam caught him while driving his wife while going to the hospital to deliver their long-awaited baby. While the wife is stranded in the car, the teacher keeps delivering speeches to the stranded crowds about Egypt's glorious past and its possibilities to have a better future. The crowd has no choice but to listen to the teacher's flamboyant monologues. Towards the end of the film, the baby is born almost at the same time as the explosion. This film may be not the best representative of the Egyptian cinema at the time when it was produced in 1995. However, it's among the first to start what I can call a critical cinematography associated with intense socio-economic transformations prior to the uprising of January 25th. In the following years, tens of works dealing very explicitly with the social problems experienced by different social categories and society as a whole appeared. I believe that these films represent the general mood prevailing at the time of their production. Some of them even have scenarios similar to those of the uprising, literally and visually. Terrorism and Kebab, Al-Irhab wal-Kebab, from 1992, is one such film showing the occupation of a major complex of government offices by a group of ordinary citizens. They are angry about the excessive amount of laxity and corruption characterizing social and political life in general. This is Chaos, Hiya Fawda, in 2007, also is another film that ends with a demonstration attacking a police station and killing a corrupt policeman believed to be behind different forms of corruption and abuse. Some of these scenes make viewers exclaim, what is this? Have these films been produced before or after the revolution? Some of them actually have just, scenes that you might just mix with the scenes from the revolution. You might just say, is this before or after 2011? Although some of them are actually just 2007 and 2001, etc. In other words, they call into question the general relationship between society and art represented by the film, or by films. I believe films in contemporary society contribute to shaping and sustaining ideas and feelings across different social categories. They help create a common sense about society as a whole. Most crucial in this context is when politically significant categories like the nation or the national past, present and future, in traffic light, for example, are represented by social characters that people can intimately relate to and identify with. The films included in my paper are too many to be summarized in this short time. I've watched almost 50 films in a period of 2 months. Well, some of them I actually watched for the second time just to double check. But a few examples, however, may suffice to illustrate my argument, or the argument I'm making here. In 2001, there is a film called A Citizen, a Detective, and a Thief. The citizen is a middle-class man leading a decadent life. He is forced to deal with people belonging to lower classes, represented as thieves. The two sides are mediated by the detective, who abuses the conflicts between them for his own benefit. And of course, the detective is the government. He's just representing the government. This is Chaos, Hiya Fawda, noted above. It brings the issue of the nation and the different ideologies at work in society through a number of individual characters. This film, however, suggests that the relation between different classes are conflictual and cannot be peacefully mediated. It ends with a whole mob, actually, attacks a police station. Ibrahim al-Abyad in 2009 is another film that focuses on lower classes represented as violent and potentially very, very dangerous. A man and a woman are taken to represent the entire classes, collectively called the Tabaqat al-Sha'biyya, or lower classes in Egypt. The two are unprivileged or underprivileged, but keen to lead a good life and insist on forming a family based on intimacy and loyalty. احكي لي يا شهرزاد أو احكي يا شهرزاد, which is Shahrazad, Tell Me a Story, is another important film produced in 2010. It narrates stories of 5 women suffering from unequal relations occurring in a society dominated by men who are corrupt and abusive. Most crucial is the fact that intimate relations in this film are infiltrated by politics. The film tries to say that it has become extremely impossible to live in Egypt or in such a society where even personal emotions are instantly expressions of the dominant power relations operating at the level of society at large. The Aquarium, Ginint al-Asmak, is another important film produced in 2008. It is a surrealistic representation, I would say, of the whole socio-political life in Egypt at the time. An entire generation is portrayed as living in constant fear. It has departed from the lifestyle and values of older generation and living in a changing world characterized by an industry of fear, so to speak. Fear from terrorism, Israel, the government, the different epidemics, all constitute a gloomy motif permeating the whole entire film. I argue that as works of art, these films construct what can be called an imagined society that contains within itself aspects of both unity and fragmentation. Unity is expressed in terms of the nation and the family, as well as an assumed collaboration among different classes. This unity is generally portrayed as a consequence of perceived injustice against low-income groups and women, as Hazem just, I wished that you'd keep that picture that shows the lower classes and upper classes with Fatima Khadija in the middle, yeah, because the films just show that, you know, the films agree with Hazem to a large extent that actually underlying the whole thing is just a very deep division between classes and women. These deep divisions and women are dangerous somehow, and they have engendered somehow a revolution. This unity is generally portrayed as a consequence of perceived injustice against low-income groups and women. I view these films as representations in the service of ideological positions constituted within a discourse on the social good. The film producers are themselves members of the middle classes, speaking on behalf of the entire society while drawing upon their own feelings. Among these are feelings of anxiety, mistrust, and fear. To understand these works, one ought to situate and contrast them with other representations like songs, stories, sermons, books, and other representations authored in the same period by members of other classes in order to have a fuller picture. All these representations can then be critically examined in the context of diverse lived experiences. Furthermore, I view these films are discursive statements produced by an urban elite functionally linked to existing forms of governance. They are a kind of portrayal for these elites in the context of a society of their own making. I narrate the films as if they were parts of one single scenario focused on society, as the main subject embodied in various roles or characters, including ordinary citizens, policemen, businessmen, government officials, wives, husbands, friends, siblings, etc. The film's discourse is, of course, multivocal vis-à-vis the existing power relations. It stretches from complacency to critical engagement and up to open confrontation and violent challenge. Despite this diversity, however, the films are underlined with a unitary logic stemming from a set of assumptions about the social good. It is still early to judge these assumptions, although they do not sound as totally alien to liberal traditions characterizing members of the middle classes. Across the films, there is a constant call for a collaboration between different components of the social body on the one hand and the government on the other. As this collaboration proves unattainable, the government is accused of corruption and thus considered responsible for producing various forms of disunity. The latter is underscored as a source of violence resulting from two main sources: the underprivileged sections of society represented principally by the lower classes and women. The film selected for this paper presents a society imagined as increasingly fidgety and divided. One has to say, however, that the elements of unity are far more than those of division and fragmentation. Most of the films emphasize unity, I have to say. Very few emphasize things that may lead, which is quite curious. This is before the revolution. As representations, however, they need to be contrasted with lived experiences, including the ones that occurred after the revolution. Then there must be many elements to be criticized in these works of art. One element has to do with the social relations they represent. We all know that these are continually reproduced in daily life as a response to shifting socioeconomic and political circumstances. In moments like the one in Egypt, the one Egypt is undergoing now, the latter process must be highly critical and exceedingly complicated. The reason consists in the tens of issues and questions that have been left undiscussed or even never discussed under the rule of oppressive governments. Furthermore, like all complex societies, Egypt is a highly differentiated society with so many reasons for conflict and division. The films included speak of a very limited number of these reasons by focuses on categories of social class and gender. But we all know, even before the revolution, that different forms of friction were taking place on issues of religion, ethnicity, profession, social welfare, and equal development in rural and urban areas, just to count but a few. These issues have to do with the domestic politics, which are intricately linked to the country's position in the world system and the kind of international and regional roles it plays or supposed or forced to fulfill or to play. On all these fronts, therefore, there must be many other issues relating to society and social cohesion addressed superficially by the films quoted above. In conclusion, if a fuller picture is to be produced from these films and their relations to society, then society should be situated and contrasted within this complex map of social conflict occurring domestically as well as internationally. Reducing the internal issues to be only about class and gender relations is rather simplistic and speaks of concerns of one single slice of society. On the other hand, representing Egypt as a unified country facing an outside world reduced to few categories like the West, Israel, and the Arab world can be anything but adequate. I haven't really included the films that speak about Egypt and the outside world, including Safara fil Amara wal Asal Aswad. These films just present Egypt as just, something that can just facing the rest of the world in very interesting ways, I have to say. But, they somehow overlook so many complications within society as well as between that society and the outside world. As noted above, the producers of these works of art come from a rather homogeneous social background with more or less uniform categories employed in their representations. Now the country is witnessing the rise of new groups and ideologies that may produce new representations based on formerly excluded categories and material interests. These works represent new forms of imagination and will add new dimensions to the imagined society mentioned above. It may even contribute to creating an entirely new society or an entirely new imagined society. In all cases, these imagined societies are mere representations of lived experiences of everyday life. There is no doubt that the latter is plural and that its plurality will surface up in the rising, hopefully democratic society. The contrast between the two, therefore, will include newly recognized lived experiences, newly recognized, or just, lived experiences that have never been recognized in the public sphere, regulated by the mainstream media and the state. All representations are ultimately contestable, especially when they are about disputable relations. Disputes are expected to identify in the years to come, and with them, forms of representation will be more diverse and hopefully more intriguing and interesting than the existing ones. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. Well, we have a nice long 25 minutes for discussion before we have our half-hour break, so we can move to questions and interventions, but please, mainly questions. Yes? Yes. Oh, is it that you want to record what they're saying, or that they want to be heard in any case? If you'd go to the mic, please, yes. I see, I didn't see them. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to ask both of the panelists, in their opinion, I was thinking, well, what's the worst we can expect and what's the best we can expect? So I'll do away with the worst, because I think a lot of us understand that a fundamentalist, Islamist, religious society is probably the worst. But given the very interesting cultural and political and economic history of Egypt, which people don't shake off overnight, obviously, I'd like to ask both of you, honestly, what you believe in or envision the best we can expect in terms of things like women's rights, civil liberties, and other basic human rights.
تفضل حازم. انت السلطة هنا.
Well, I have to be very honest with you. Things are so fluid now that it's so hard to predict what's going to happen. But obviously, it's a turbulent period, and we don't know how long it will take. I think the best you would expect that with the first time of people with strict religious orientations in power, I think I hope that their learning curve happens quickly, and they began to make the necessary compromises between your convictions about how things should be and between reaching out to other sectors of society in order not to impose your vision on them, and in order, to have a consensus in moving forward. I don't see this as being an easy process, and honestly, there are mixed signals. I mean, their rhetoric is mixed, and their attitude is mixed. Some of them are very comforting when they speak, others are, you just get so scared when they speak. So it's really in the practice that we will see what's going to happen. Of course, the initial indications were not so helpful. I mean, particularly the constitutional committee that's supposed to write the constitution. I mean, the trend was not good at all. Now we are having a pause. I hope it gets better.
What you mean by that? They don't know.
Oh, I'm sorry. There was, according to the transition process, there is supposed to be a constitutional committee out of 100 persons who should draft the new constitution of Egypt. The Muslim Brothers in the beginning said they will not attempt to dominate this, and they will reach out to all segments of society and have a consensus about moving forward. However, when it came to practice, they basically, both among them and the Salafis, they secured 2/3 of this committee, which means that they basically wanted to dominate the decision-making in it. As a result of that, the 40 other members simply withdrew, and that included the Egyptian Church, Al-Azhar, which is the official Islamic institution of Egypt, and the Supreme Court. I mean, these are very influential players in society, and many of the syndicates. They simply withdrew because they thought this is not the way to write a constitution. Luckily enough, a few days ago, there was a court decision that this is not right the way it was formed, and they ordered it to be disbanded. Now, the official line of the Muslim Brotherhood was good in that reaction. They said, we will respect the law, and even though they had the chance to appeal, they said, we are not going to appeal. I hope they stick to that. And they said, we are going to look to reach out to others to try to see how to best reach consensus on that. If that happens, that's a good start, and that could be towards the best outcome that you were asking about. Sorry for the very long answer, but it's not an easy question.
Just very briefly, it's actually this is a very relative question, because what is the best and what's the worst can actually be different from one side to another. But you have defined what you considered as the best, which is just more freedoms and more democracy, etc. I mean, I don't know. What is the best for me is very difficult now to really, but it can be quite wishful thinking. I can just tell you what I can wish, what I wish that would happen. I really wish that this fluid period that Hazem referred to lasts for longer, because they are very complicated issues, very, very under-discussed and never discussed issues that are changing now. And there's a possibility for them to be changed for the better, including, civil rights and the development of a whole culture, political culture that's very underdeveloped. That's kind of not always there, almost not there at all. all this kind of, what we witness these days, what we watch these days of clumsy kind of behavior in the parliament and kind of underdeveloped ways of expression and all of that. It's a result of a long periods of oppression. So I think this fluidity is actually very useful. And I think it's going to last, which is actually good for me, if it's not even the best. Because it will give an opportunity for people who have never spoken to speak and to find ways to organize themselves and to somehow find ways to build what is called generally civil society or organizations of civil society, which are almost not there. You know, or if they are there, they have been so weakened and attenuated during the last few decades. So that's the best I would actually wish for. And it's not easy. The worst that can happen actually is just for people just to go back to the, you know, to what's already existing. You know, the snow has melted. There's no snow in Egypt. There's sand. So the sand has, you know, gone away. And what we have now in Egypt are two major forces, just, you know, the religious currents and the military institution. And the others have been actually, you know, weakened over the years to almost totally uninfluential, you know, very marginalized other forms of other ideological positions and other political organizations and parties, etc. So if the SCAF and their allies, who are, I think, somehow among the religious current, manage to solve the existing problems and go back, you know, what exists now is actually the old regime, no more than that. I mean, in terms of the basic form of the state, I'm actually speaking in very, you know, revolutionary terms. In revolutionary terms, nothing substantial has happened in Egypt. Like, you know, in changing the structure of the state, for example, or questioning the form of a state that exists in the country. Nothing really substantial, I mean, very big, you know. So if we go back to that system, or we just don't change it, that actually can be quite the worst for me. I don't know whether this is just kind of very brief thoughts.
Yes? Oh, please.
I have a very simple question. What is the added value of such conferences and workshops? During the past 2 months, I attended many workshops and conferences about Egypt and revolution, etc. Who are the stakeholders of such workshops and conferences? Is it us as audience? Is it the people in Egypt and Tahrir? Is it the people here in the States? One of the conferences I attended actually last month was in ECOSOC in UN. It was organized by Columbia University students and experts. It talked about how to use the social media in building new cities. Not building Cairo, not rebuilding what happened in Egypt. No, it was about how to rebuild and to develop new cities, and precisely here in New York, how to develop New York, how to reduce pollution, etc., etc. So again, my simple question, who are the stakeholders of such workshops and conferences? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Hazem? Well, this actually just, I was just thinking about that. I think about it all the time. And I'm not very, very clear about who is actually holding these things and why. Sometimes I think it's just kind of, you know, people who have interest in Egypt or in notions that are at, you know, at stake in the country, which concern almost everyone in the world. And this is enough for them to, you know, to hold. But I think your question is quite valid when it comes to why don't we just hold such conferences in a way that would lead to engaging with those people who are most concerned, the revolution in Egypt, etc. I promise you, I will translate my paper and publish it in Arabic and actually try to, you know, form a group to initiate debates about forms of representations and how much valid they are in Egypt. I have had a long problem with forms of representation in general and forms of representation in the Arab world in particular. And I'm not happy at all about the way we are represented, neither domestically nor internationally. So I think I think at some point we should. Mohammed now is just engaged, is kind of filmmaker, rising filmmaker. He's trying to address the same issue by just, and creating debates and creating new platforms and new forums. It's not an easy issue and it's not a simple issue. It's actually a major, major need for us in the Arab world. The old forms of communication are totally expired, and they just lead to the interest of very limited number of the population, very limited number of interests. So.
It seems that I didn't understand my questions correctly.
Well, even that, I mean, it's good that I could see that.
What I wanted to say from that is, during these past 30 years, billions of dollars have been given to Egypt. If just 1% of this money were dedicated to education, to infrastructure, to make infrastructure accessible for people with a disability like me, I think that would create a democracy. Just 1% of this money are given. That's what was the main aim of my question, actually. How to be more practical in solving our problems. That's it.
You can't, simply you can't, if you don't have the correct kind of social organization, social and political organization that can act effectively. And how to reach there, how to build a good and effective and efficient and also something that we have a consensus about. You can't really have that with the existing regimes. The existing regimes are so focused and self-absorbed in their own interests. Look at what they have been doing. They have been going out of Cairo, living out in the desert with a very unsustainable ways or styles of life, and you know the rest of the story. With the existing structures of power, I think we can't really go anywhere but where we are now. So initiating debates and having forums for discussion and challenging the existing relations is the only way, I think, is the only way. Because, they have been trying for the last 60 years, I think, Is the only way is just to challenge the existing kind of structures of power, which have actually brought us where we are now.
Could I just say also that although the United States, since the Camp David Accords, has typically supposedly given Egypt between $2 and $1.5 billion a year in aid, that it's a trick. Most of the so-called aid to Egypt is actually aid to U.S. corporations because all the materiel has to be bought in the United States. And then half of it is military. And not useful military, actually. The Egyptian army now has warehouses full of sophisticated American military equipment that most of its personnel don't know how to operate. And they don't know what to do with it. In fact, when they had that tiff with the Americans over the non-governmental organizations promoting democracy, it seemed clear that the Egyptian military, could take or leave that aid. So the way that Congress structured the aid was not, in fact, conducive to development of things like literacy of Egyptian peasantry and so forth. And frankly, the Mubarak government wasn't, I don't think, very interested in human development. So it seems to me that one of the outcomes of your question is that Egypt now has the opportunity, at least, to change these policies, and that will be one of the ways in which the new government has to be judged. Who got here first? I didn't see. Yeah, okay, fine, please.
I was interested in. I thought that at the beginning, when you were speaking about films, that you spoke about 3 particular films that you thought were crucial. I got that one was Traffic Light, one was A Citizen, Detective, and Thief. And what was the third one? And are they available with English subtitles?
Yeah, well, the most important, Traffic Light is not actually the best, technically speaking, and all that, but it's actually very interesting because it's actually among the earliest. Mm-hmm. مواطن ومخبر وحرامي اللي هو Citizen, Detective, and this is actually available on the web. You can actually download it as a whole.
Okay.
I don't know whether it has subtitles, but you know.
If it's in Egyptian,
Yeah.
it won't do me, or Arabic, it won't do me any good. But I think it's an interesting way for us to have some kind of insight into the situation. I would like to know if these things are available. And the third one?
The second one is This is Chaos.
This is Chaos.
This is Chaos. And the third, actually 4 of them, I would really see that as they're very important. This is Citizen, Detective, and Thief. And This is Chaos. And the third is The Aquarium.
I'm sorry?
The Aquarium. The Aquarium.
The Aquarium.
جنينة الأسماك. And the fourth is احكي يا شهرزاد, which is Shahrazad, Tell Me a Story. 4.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Thank you, gentlemen, for an excellent series of talks here. My question has to do with the role of the public intellectual in Egypt. Throughout the 20th century, important public intellectuals such as Taha Hussein and Naguib Mahfouz have helped shape the future vision of Egypt. And I'm wondering who you think the most prominent public intellectuals are today, and what you see the role of the public intellectual in Egypt moving forward in the wake of the Arab Spring.
I think part of the issue of the role of the public intellectual has also to do with the means of media now. I mean, I think the new social media and stuff like that has not diminished, but also diluted a little bit the role of a public intellectual in shaping the minds, because news travels much faster and people are connecting much faster and things are much more diffused. So there is no like figure as such, like the circumstances are different. I mean, the circumstances that produce Tahsin Akad and others are different. But if you are talking about like organic intellectuals who moved the revolution, I mean, there were so many of them. I mean, like, not intellectuals, not necessarily writers, although there are some of them. You have a sociologist, Saadin Ibrahim, who's sitting here, who had many writings in that and triggered it. You had, there were many intellectuals who wrote stories that were prophetic about the revolution. I mean, because obviously there was a general atmosphere. One of them is Ibrahim Abdel Megid, who even wrote a book after that about the story of the revolution. I mean, there are so many of them, but I honestly think we are in an age that you cannot identify particular figures as such. It's much more diffused. And actually, that is part of the problem of the Egyptian revolution as well, that there was no leaders as such. It was such a diffused leadership. In addition to that, there was a conscious attempt not to try to have leaderships, and I think that was a big mistake, but I mean, there was good logic for it. And it is a dilemma which they are paying the price for now. I don't know if you have heard Dr. El-Baradei, who used to be head of the International Atomic Agency, announced yesterday that they're going to establish a party with all the youth who did the revolution. And in his speech, he said, we are going to start from square one, because that's a reading of the situation, that in a way we are at square one. That's their interpretation anyway. So at least they're trying to do something about it now. Maybe a little bit too late, but at least it's better late than never.
Just very briefly, I would totally agree on what Hazem said, of course. But you know, we are not actually different from the situation here in Egypt. In the Arab world, probably in the whole world, this issue of intellectualism and whatever has been fought quite fiercely. This, you know, there has been somehow an implicit policy to fight intellectuals, to actually marginalize them, to send them to prison. Look at, I mean, you know, we are privileged here to have Dr. Saadin Ibrahim, who has been actually fought openly, you know, sent to prison and all of that. Many others experience the same thing. Not only intellectuals, but also what, in Gramscian terms, organic intellectuals, like, you know, politicians, like Adel Hussein and many others, have been actually openly resisted and sent. There was, once I read an article called Between the Hospital and the Prison. Sometimes they made them sick in the prisons. You know, they lived between the hospital and the prison. They were forced to live that way. This is, of course, next to the condition that we are living now, that ideas have been looked down upon somehow. What is more important in neoliberal economics and the context of neoliberal economics, that is dominant here in the same way it is dominant in Egypt. It's just, you know, ideas that they don't sell are not really worth looking at somehow.
So I have a question.
Could I just say something? I'm sorry to interrupt you, but You know, in Egypt, there are kind of two tiers of public intellectuals. There are people who mainly write in Arabic and who are well known inside Egypt. And then there are people with an international reputation. And the people with the international reputation are the ones to which, you know, Anglophone Americans would have access to. So I don't mean to discriminate against the former, but if you're interested in following people who, you know, have a voice and are writing in English and are not unimportant in the Egyptian scene, Ala Aswani is somebody who could be mentioned. You know, in some ways, Noel Saadawi has reemerged. She had been jailed by Sadat and has a big oeuvre of translated work on essentially Egyptian feminism and fiction, and has been very vocal in supporting the revolution. So just since we were requested for, you know, if you were looking for Naguib Mahfouz of today, there are many younger people who are mainly writing in Arabic, but those are two that come to mind who would be accessible to an American audience.
One single note, just one single note about intellectuals, that, you know, next to those major grand intellectuals that we were experienced to in the 70s and before, there is a rising class of intellectuals that I'm personally very interested in. Younger, very energetic, and very critical, and even cynical, and dyadic about the whole. See, I mean, they are not, you know, they are not actually concerned with preserving the whole structure. And there are names like Bilal Fadl and you know, many others. They are much younger, and actually these people have knowledge that is much deeper and much more relevant to what's going on than the people who have actually been isolated for some reason, for some time. Of course, there's, you know, Galal Amin and Saadid Ibrahim and Fahmy Huwaidi and Muhammad Sayyid Ahmed and Ala al-Aswani and many others. But, you know, I just feel that as an anthropologist who has lived among, you know, lower classes and also middle classes and actually traveled, that there is something really new arising in the contemporary society of Egypt that the older generation cannot really grasp for some reason. Which name?
Ala al-Aswani.
Ala al-Aswani? Yes, yeah.
So I just wanted to ask a question to Dr. Tabishat that might help get at this question we had earlier about the relevance of these types of events. And I was wondering if you could make it explicit for us exactly how you're theorizing in your paper the relationship between political change or change in the sphere of political economy and cultural change. Because towards the end of your paper, it sounded to me like you were saying that cultural producers reflect political economic change in their cultural practice, sort of with the current films, but particularly in the end when you said, after the revolution, we should be seeing a new type of film.
Yes.
But you also say that the films show scenes that almost were prescient of the revolution, that they sort of came up with forms for the revolution that were then enacted in practice post-film. So I'm wondering if you can make it explicit exactly how you theorize the relationship between culture like film and political change. Is it always a reflection, or can there be bidirectional influence there?
To tell you the truth, I was inspired by Benjamin's classic, The Art of Work in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. I read that article probably 5 times before writing this. I mean, it's not mentioned. It's mentioned in the original paper, in the longer paper. And this is actually where I find the link between what's happening in the films and what happens in society. I think this is a fascinating, prophetic kind of description, Benjamin's paper, where he just, you know, thinks that the link between what's happening on theater in the films and the public is unpredictable. It's not actually always what happens in the film is a good representation or a right representation of what happens in society, but films do contribute to shaping the feelings and the mood of the public. And they also make the public mood and the individual mood somehow very similar, because when you just show a film, the response of individuals is somehow conditioned and determined by the response of the public. So we somehow experience a collective response, and we have to abide. We have to somehow, when people applaud, we applaud. So this is why we think what we see on theater is somehow a good reflection, a good representation. But we as observers, when we just observe the films and compare them to lived experience, experiences is a different story. My approach to films is somehow multi-layered. My own experience is one, and the viewer's experience is another, and the people who have produced them and their implicit notions and feelings and thoughts is another. So it is kind of, again, Walter Benjamin's, kind of thoughts. The other thing which I find very inspiring is Raymond Williams' notion of the structure of feeling, where he thinks that each period is somehow characterized by a structure of feeling that you cannot really sense by relying on pattern culture or going to the library or just speaking to intellectuals. You have somehow to delve into everyday life and see that very thin, flimsy layer of how people feel things. I did both. I did fieldwork in Egypt in 1995 to 1997 and actually listened to many stories of, I'm a medic actually originally. I was trained in the medical school and I moved to anthropology and started to somehow combine between medicine and medical care and anthropology. And that kind of field gave me a good, good place to see how people embody society, how people speak and phrase social problems and social pressures in bodily terms. Now, the film, as an example, the film I quoted in the beginning, which is Traffic Light, interestingly refers to something that actually I listen to in the field. People, when they say, I have pressure in my blood, and I need ضغط, yeah? I have pressure. They sometimes said, I have pressure because the streets are so pressured. Traffic lights don't work, whatever. The same scene as my body is like the city. The city is pressured and crowded. My body is. To see that actually represented in the films might actually tell you that the middle classes, whatever, the filmmakers occasionally represent what's going on, which is very interesting, quite. But sometimes I think, many of the films are self-absorbed and they are speaking about interests of a particular section of society. After the revolution, I really hope that there will be more forms of expression, forms of representation, not necessarily films, but also stories and novels and songs and plays that may be actually speaking about or telling about the interest of other classes, and other categories. Yeah. I hope I have answered your question.
Just one last quick question, yes.
Hi, I was wondering if you could, either or both of you could comment, since you've both been talking about different forms of media. I was wondering how citizens are able or not able to feel that they're participating in the ongoing process of articulating, say, the Constitution. How are people staying engaged or aware of what's going on? And is there a large difference between urban Egyptians and rural? Because a lot of this younger Facebook, mobile phone, Twitter imagery that we've all seen and we're all aware of, I'm wondering how available that is sort of throughout Egypt and how people are staying involved with the ongoing process.
Actually, ironically enough, one of the most successful areas the last government had in economic development was basically the number of Egyptians having cell phones and those having access to computer. And it's both in rural and in cities. Of course, as you know, mainly it was the youth who triggered this revolution and so on. I have access to a lot of them. They are really daily and constantly monitoring what's going on. But also, as you might know, the political landscape changed so much. They are not an actual player right now in the developments going on, but you see them cracking jokes and criticizing and making, it's a very vibrant society still in that sense. But there is definitely a schism between the role they played in triggering the revolution and the role they are playing now in what they are in just watching and commenting. However, ironically enough, all the new comers are avidly using social media. I mean, the military council is using it. They have their website, and so are the Muslim Brothers and their speakers and all the Salafis. I mean, all of them are now having Twitter and Facebook, and everybody has realized this new weapon and are using it. So it's very vibrant, and it's in both ways. But as I told you, those who really, the youth, they are watching very carefully, making comments and everything, but they are unfortunately not part of what's going on right now.
Just very briefly, I mean, this is a very important question. So thank you, because you know what? Actually, we're seeing now of a revolution is actually taking place effectively between very limited number of the population. I mean, in Egypt, you have a product. We are living now the product of 30 or 40 years of just making the population illiterate and uneducated. I mean, the issue, that applies not only in Egypt, in other countries too, but we are speaking about Egypt now. And this has been the result of long, you know, and very complicated policies, guided by the World Bank and the IMF and local regime, and of course sponsored by, you know who, just, you know, by imperial policies. So you ended up actually having 85 million people living in Egypt. Probably 50 million of them barely, they don't read and write, okay? You end up, and you have 35 million who read and write. Now, if you look closely at people who read and write, how many times do they read and write? And if they read, in what way do they read? Okay, because those guys who have been educated, 35 million, education in Egypt in the last 20 or 30 years has been impoverished beyond belief. You go to a local school or a local university or whatever, people reach the senior level in the university and they are studying English literature, for example, and you just speak to them in English, you know? Actually, one of the films show that. I'm not speaking a secret. I'm not saying a secret. Just, you know, Hiya Fawda, this is chaos, actually shows that. You know, a fourth-year student, and, you know, she cannot really speak English. She's teaching English, and she's not. Actually, the film shows her teaching English, and she herself cannot read. So, this actually, I'm just making this introduction to tell you that what's happening now, this is why I feel, I really wish that this period of fluidity goes longer, so that this marginalized bulk of people can somehow participate on the long run. Because what's the point of just reproducing the system by few who have always been in power? You know? I feel at the moment that they are terribly excluded. Not only the illiterate, but also a large number of the educated and not educated. They are not educated. So.
Thank you very much. It's been a great panel.